Hey guys, it's Ellie. Welcome back to Bite-Sized Book of Mormon. Glad to have you with me. So if you've never been here before, this is just a podcast where I read through one chapter of the Book of Mormon each episode, and I give a little bit of context, a little bit of insight, a little bit of fun. So yeah, stick around. So if you remember last episode, it was a little bit of a wrap-up from Nephi to kind of wrap up the writings of Jacob, because for the last few chapters before chapter 11, it had been Jacob talking to the people, and then chapter 11 was from Nephi being like, okay, that's all I'm going to write from Jacob. And then he talked a little bit about how God proves his words to the people, which I think is pretty cool. So yeah, pretty brief chapter last week, and the chapter today shouldn't be too long either. And also, going forward for the next 10-ish chapters, if I remember correctly, there's going to be Isaiah quotage. So we've had Isaiah before, but not for as long as we're going to have coming up, because this is what's known as the Isaiah chapters. Legitimately, there's just a ton of Isaiah all in a row. We're not going to do this for all the chapters, but just for the Isaiah chapters, we're going to start reading the chapter summary, because it gives you a really good jumping off point to interpret the chapter from, because it tells you what is being talked about, and so you can kind of read the verses in a way that helps you understand it better. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So yeah, I think without further ado, we start 2 Nephi chapter 12. Isaiah sees the latter-day temple, gathering of Israel, and millennial judgment and peace. The proud and wicked will be brought low at the second coming. Compare Isaiah 2. So the previous chapters that we've been quoting from Isaiah are from later in Isaiah, like Isaiah 50-something or 40-something, and this is Isaiah 2. So Nephi is kind of starting from the beginning as he's quoting this Isaiah. But it seems pretty cool. It seems like we'll be going over a little bit more latter-day prophecies, which is awesome. Talks about the temple, gathering of Israel, as per usual, and the judgment, and stuff like that. So, yeah. The word that Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. And it shall come to pass in the last days, when the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. And many people shall go and say, Come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. I really like verse 3 because it's talking about the temple. Because if you don't know, the mountain of the Lord is basically symbolism for the temple. All over in Old Scripture and New Scripture, prophets are called to mountains to be closer to God and to kind of commune with God. And so that is kind of what the temples do in our latter days. So for reference, when someone mentions the mountain of the Lord, they're talking about the temple. But I like in this verse where it says, He will teach us of his ways and we will walk in his paths. That's what happens in the temple. We are taught of his ways, and we walk in God's paths. I don't know, I like that wording of what we do in the temple. It's pretty cool. And he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. O house of Jacob, come ye, and let us walk in the light of the Lord. Yea, come, for ye have all gone astray, every one to his wicked ways. Therefore, O Lord, thou hast forsaken thy people, the house of Jacob, because they replenished from the east, and hearken unto soothsayers like the Philistines, and they please themselves in the children of strangers. Their land is also full of silver and gold, neither is there any end of their treasures. Their land is also full of horses, neither is there any end of their chariots. Their land is also full of idols. They worship the work of their own hands, that which their fingers have made. And the mean man boweth not down, and the great man humbleth himself not. Therefore, forgive him not. So this all sounds pretty harsh, God, as we know, is forgiving and loving, and he doesn't abandon his people, and yet in these verses it says God has abandoned these people, and that God will not forgive these people. But I think it's not God's choice. I think it's the people's choice, and they have made this choice to distance themselves from God and to fill their life with things that are not of him, and so he can't reach them. I think that's more of what's happening here. Obviously, this is my personal interpretation, far from official doctrine, but I think it's a pretty reasonable way to read this. So in verses 6, 7, and 8, it talks about the house of Jacob and how the Lord has forsaken them, and then it goes on to explain all the stuff they have. It says that they have silver and gold and treasures and horses and chariots and idols and stuff that they've made with their own hands, and how they worship all these things and how they put them all above God, it seems. And it says that in verse 6 how they hearken unto soothsayers like the Philistines. And I think therefore we can assume they are not hearkening to God. They're hearkening to these people instead. And in verse 9 it says, The mean man boweth not down, and the great man humbleth himself not. And it's been said many times in the scriptures before, if you don't come unto God with a broken heart and a contrite spirit, then his power can't work in your life. At least not in the same way that it can for those who do come unto him with a broken heart and a contrite spirit. And being proud and bowing not down is definitely not coming to God with a broken heart and contrite spirit. So yeah, pretty cool section. O ye wicked ones, enter into the rock, and hide thee in the dust, for the fear of the Lord and the glory of his majesty shall smite thee. And it shall come to pass that the lofty looks of man shall be humbled, and the haughtiness of men shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. For the day of the Lord of hosts cometh upon all nations, yea, upon every one, yea, upon the proud and lofty, and upon every one who is lifted up, and he shall be brought low. Yea, and the day of the Lord shall come upon all the cedars of Lebanon, for they are high and lifted up, and upon all the oaks of Bashan, and upon all the high mountains, and upon all the hills, and upon all the nations which are lifted up, and upon every people, and upon every high tower, and upon every fenced wall, and upon all the ships of the sea, and upon all the ships of Tarshish, and upon all pleasant pictures. And the loftiness of man shall be bowed down, and the haughtiness of men shall be made low, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. So this is all talking about the judgment. As it mentioned in the chapter summary, it's talking about the great judgment day. And it's interesting because it talks about how the house of Jacob is haughty, and they have idols, and they have all this treasure, and they are very much not humble. They're not listening to God. They're not letting him into their lives. And then he says, everyone will be made humble. Everyone will be made to bow down in the great and last day of the Lord. The great and last day applies to everyone and everything. It talks about all the cedars of Lebanon and the ships of Tarshish and every high tower and fenced wall. And it just says everything will be affected by God's judgment. You cannot escape. No matter how proud you are, no matter how much hubris you have in thinking that you can escape God, you cannot. And I think that's a really cool way to explain that better humble yourself or it will happen for you, and not good things will come of that. We learn several times later in the scriptures, in fact it's said pretty expressly in Alma somewhere I believe, that being compelled to be humble is not as good as making yourself humble. And that's something that's taught in like the story of the Zoramites, which is like way later in Alma, but that is something that we learn specifically from one of the missionaries in the Book of Mormon later. So this is a pretty cool principle that they're bringing up this early in the Book of Mormon. And the idols he shall utterly abolish. And they shall go into the holes of the rocks, and into the caves of the earth, for the fear of the Lord shall come upon them, and the glory of his majesty shall smite them, when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth. In that day a man shall cast his idols of silver, and his idols of gold, which he hath made for himself to worship, to the moles and to the bats, to go into the clefts of the rocks, and into the tops of the ragged rocks, for the fear of the Lord shall come upon them, and the majesty of his glory shall smite them, when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth. Cease ye from man, whose breath is in his nostrils, for wherein is he to be accounted of? I like verse 20 and 21 because it says, in that day, what man will do is they will chuck their idols to the animals, and they're going to run away. They're going to run into the rocks. They're going to run into the ragged cliff peaks, and they're going to try and hide from God. I think that's kind of what the first half of verse 21 is saying, that they're going to the clefts of the rocks and the tops of the ragged rocks. I think that is an attempt to run away from God and hide themselves from God. And obviously it doesn't work. But I think that kind of shows the desperation of the sinful man in the day of judgment, that they are willing to try anything to get away from God, to even just chuck their idols to the animals and just run to try and get away. And that is kind of very visceral. Like, I feel like we felt that before. Like, we felt our just deep imperfection in front of God, and we felt his power, and we've just felt so inadequate to the point that we just want to hide. And I'm not saying we've all experienced that, but I think that's not an uncommon feeling to experience, because obviously as humans we are very imperfect, and although the day of judgment has not come yet, it's very easy to feel God's judgment on us when we're just being imperfect. And even though he's not judging us harshly, and he, loves us and will forgive us, sometimes it's easy to feel like he is judging us, even if he's not. And to a very small degree, I understand what these people are doing. They're desperately throwing all their sins away, all their idols away, and just running, which, I don't know, it seems very human. I would do that. If I was being wicked and God just came tomorrow, I would freak out in the same way, I think. And so this chapter so far is really interesting because it's talking about, like, well, what would you do if the judgment happened and you were being sinful? It really causes you to reflect, to being like, am I prideful? Do I have idols before God? Do I have a humble heart? Do I bow to God, or do I not bow to God? Like, should I be afraid of the judgment? This is a really cool chapter because it just causes you to ask yourself those questions. So yeah, killer chapter. Pretty short, only 22 verses, but really, really cool. Like I've mentioned before, Isaiah can be very intimidating, especially for me, because, I don't know, I'm not a scholar. I just enjoy the Book of Mormon, and I just read it to the best of my ability. But I hope this podcast helps you understand. It definitely helps me understand. Just reading it to you guys into a microphone just helps me break down what the chapters mean better than when I just read it to myself, which is actually pretty awesome. So yeah, great chapter. I really enjoyed how it kind of sets in front of us, like, okay, this is what the judgment day is going to be like if you're sinful. Are you ready to deal with that? Or do you want to be humble? Like, it just kind of asks those questions, and it's really, really cool how it causes you, at least it causes me, to sit back and reflect a little bit on, like, what I'm doing, and if I'm humble, and if I'm really, really prioritizing God. So yeah, pretty awesome. So the standout verse for this chapter is going to be verse 10, which says, "O ye wicked ones, enter into the rock, and hide thee in the dust, for the fear of the Lord and the glory of his majesty shall smite thee." So, as you already know, I really love it when the wordings of things make me understand it differently, or frame it in a different way in my mind. And this is a really powerful way of saying, if you are wicked, you're kind of screwed. Like, you will be smitten by the fear and the glory of God's majesty. And that is, like, impossible to imagine. I cannot even imagine God's majesty, and to be struck by it in, like, complete and utter, like, cosmic fear is just so wild to think about. Like, oh my goodness. And this also kind of touches on what I've already mentioned, how the wicked ones will enter into the rock and hide in the dust. Like, they're going to try and hide from God in their desperation to get away from him. And I think that these hypothetical people that Isaiah's written about running away from God in the great and last judgment day, they know it's not going to work. They know that God can, I guess, get to them. They know that God can find them, but they don't know what else to do. They're scrambling. And yeah, so I really kind of relate with these people, which is not a great thing to relate with, but it's a very human thing to do, to, like, be caught in your wickedness and mistakes and just not really have anything else to do except for run away, even though that is completely useless. So yeah, pretty awesome chapter. I hope that this chapter also caused you to reflect a little bit on, like, what you're really doing with your life and what you really prioritize, because, you know, the judgment day is going to come for all of us, and I think that it's important that we all be prepared. Makes you reflect. So yeah, I think that's the episode for today. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you tuning in. As usual, there are those links in the show notes, 3 of them, in fact. The first one is just a free web version of the Book of Mormon. The other 2 are app downloads. So if you do not have access to your own copy, physical or otherwise, I would highly suggest you read along, because it's so good. And you can mark up and make note of and stuff like that on things that I don't even talk about. So anyways, thank you again for listening. Glad to have you with me, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.